Well, welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn discussion, the scary side of psychological safety. We're going to start by talking about what we mean by psychological safety and then focus on some of the reasons that leaders might avoid efforts to increase psychological safety in their organizations. And we'll also provide some suggestions for overcoming those scary issues. Pat and I wrote a blog post a few weeks ago on this topic, and we'll be using some of the ideas we put forward there for this conversation. So you can find that blog post if you haven't already seen it on both of our websites. I just sent you a link in the chat if you haven't seen it yet. So Pat and I will start with just brief introductions of ourselves. My name is Catherine Sanders. I think most of you from programs that I've led in the past, either at UW-Madison or in industry. I'm a human factors and work systems engineer, and I focus on what makes work healthy and productive for people. And I design programs about leadership and organizational development initiatives for a living. And I'm happy to introduce you to my longtime colleague and dear friend, Patrick Farrell, who also is from UW-Madison.
Right. Well, right now I'm a faculty member at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Until recently, I was provost for quite a long time at Lehigh. And for UW-Madison people who may not remember back that far, I was provost at Madison as well for about 3 years, a while ago. Excuse me, also occasional leadership coach. So my experience is significantly in academic leadership, particularly relatively high levels of academic leadership.
So we'd like to start with a short conversation about psychological safety. And we were hoping that each of you might type a definition of psychological safety for yourself into the chat, and we can share them here. Or if you want to raise your hand and talk to us, that's great too. Just remember, you'd be recorded if you did that. So could you give us a little definition of psychological safety and what it means to you at work? And if you felt safe, maybe an example of what that safety would be like. So I shared those questions in the chat. Can you see them, Pat?
I can, yes.
Okay,
And
good. So I was
here we go.
successful.
Great.
Here we go.
Great.
All right. So comfort in expressing ideas, suggestions that I'll be taken seriously and no harm will come. I relate to that.
I like, is that Don? Is that, or I'm sorry, I'll know it when I see it. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Oh, I missed a couple of them here.
Oh,
so
yeah,
okay, I think it's absent at some VAs, kind of like the Supreme Court said about pornography. Okay, yeah, okay. And it's a sense that I can speak openly about issues in my workplace,
Right.
with no harm to come.
Yep. Good.
Yep. No fear of scorn or retribution.
Yeah.
A sense of grounded
that's good.
safety.
That's good.
To really be, to speak up and to challenge ideas. Yeah.
Well, clearly we don't need to explain this idea to you, you all.
A culture and climate that allows everyone to come into their workplace as their authentic selves, opportunity to excel. I love it. Love it. And trust.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, it's relational, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So I think we've heard from everyone, well, maybe not everyone. I don't know if everyone has access to their keyboard right now. So Pat, do you want to share what
the kind of the working
using?
definition we've been using actually is pretty much along the exact lines, and maybe even I like a few of you have gone beyond what we might have normally said. But we would tend to think about is it's psychological safety is that sort of norms that allow all members to contribute frankly and openly without repercussions or retaliation. And as a result, perform more effectively and efficiently in their organization and relationships with each other. So,
Mhm.
I think that's a different way of saying what you all have said. And I like that a few of you have actually gone a little bit beyond that to sort of indicate what's the consequences of being in an environment where psychological safety is a norm. So that's
Mhm.
great.
Well, and so what Pat and I have been thinking a lot about, and I'm sure many of you have too, is that, since there is such overwhelming evidence that psychological safety is necessary for organizations to perform at their best, right? And to keep their best people, it's in the literature, it's in our lived experience. And so then why is it that more organizations actually don't try harder to make that happen? So, we've put together some ideas for that, and Pat's going to walk through them now.
Right. So we only have a couple slides, but I have a slide that sort of shows a few things that we see as really significant. And so let me show you that. There's just a title slide. Give me the next. There we go. But as Kathy said, what we thought might be interesting in this short webinar would be at least to talk a little bit about why, at least in my experience, and I think Kathy's as well, some of the reasons leaders actually don't seem to pursue psychological safety in the organization, despite all the evidence that would suggest it's a really positive thing. And we don't mean to present these cynically. These are real reasons which are in many organizations actually legitimate. So the first one that you can see on the slide is what we would call perceived loss of control. As you know, many leaders themselves and sometimes their organization sort of imbue the sense of leadership with also a sense of control and being on top of things and being able to sort of control discussions and outcomes. And in our experience, the opening up of the kinds of discussions that might really require psychological safety feel like they're giving up some of that expected control. And as a result, some leaders tend to shy away. A second would be distractions from tasks at hand. What we mean by that is in some organizations, leaders may feel whatever good could come of increasing psychological safety, that's not our job. That's not why we're here. It doesn't help us produce whatever it is we're expected to produce better or more quickly or less expensively. So it doesn't seem like it's relevant to kind of our task at hand. A third is that the kinds of open discussions that result from the feeling of psychological safety often elevate almost unsolvable problems. People then begin to talk about either longstanding issues or issues that perhaps transcend the workplace that may have no solution at all, or at least not simple ones. And again, a leader who sees herself or himself as a problem solver isn't anxious to sort of step into a world where there's going to be problems that perhaps can't be solved, or at least not in the near future with the resources we have. A fourth is the sense of it puts a leader typically in a vulnerable position. It's certainly my experience has been that, again, the kinds of conversations that arise once psychological safety is more of a norm may go far afield from where you started. For example, may bring up history of your organization and actions that took place long before you ever got there. But as the leader, the sense is they're now yours. And as a leader, you might say, but I wasn't responsible for these things. So there's many leaders can say, I really don't want to be put in that position where I have to defend or at least discuss my predecessor's actions, and not giving that opportunity, that's a way. But as you'll see, our view is that's not a very constructive way. A fifth approach is simply emotions. That is, it's likely the kinds of conversations that sometimes arise when the general notion of psychological safety is common, can get emotional. People have strong feelings about whether it's issues of the workplace or personal issues or other issues that can come up. And they're going to express them in that way. And again, for many leaders who perhaps are much more accustomed to maybe budget type discussions or more concrete discussions, don't always feel well prepared to be part of a conversation that's likely to become emotional for many of the participants. Finally, at least in this list, we'd say that often action to increase psychological safety in an organization made many leaders feel like it doesn't have a concrete outcome. There's not a list of deliverables or a specific result we can point to that as a result of this particular activity or this particular effort, it is now some specific action has occurred. As Kathy said early on, there's plenty of data to say that psychologically safe organizations do perform better, but that may take some time, and it may appear in ways that aren't always the normal ways we look at organizational performance. So this may not look like the kind of thing leaders do. This is not an exhaustive list, but at least it's a starter list. And we sort of wanted to use these as ways that perhaps you as a leader, if you've had that opportunity, or maybe also as someone for whom you've seen one of your leaders sort of behave in these ways, we thought maybe we just lay these out and give you a chance to sort of take them in and kind of respond a little bit to see maybe if you've seen these yourselves, experienced any of them. And I guess to the extent that you might want to say so, what's your sense of the impact when perhaps you've been in an organization with a leader who has behaved in these ways, which in our view are ways that don't support psychological safety? What have you seen as a consequence? So I'm going to stop for a minute and invite you to respond in the chat or raise your hand and make a few comments about you've seen these or haven't, or have, and here's the outcome of the consequence that you've observed as a result. Let's see. Do I need to stop share to be able to see the chat?
Perhaps.
Okay, let's do that then. There we go. Oh,
Okay.
interesting.
Subculture form.
Can you say a little more about that?
It becomes self-preservation
Yeah,
system,
good.
with many using leadership as other versus them. I can relate to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. I'm not sure what to say. I think I'm one of the psychologically safe people in our organization, but I have no decision-making authority, so I can't create any change, and our decision makers do not necessarily radiate a sense of
I
safety
sense
to
a little
employees.
Frustration there. I'm not sure if that's fair.
Can relate to that also. In my role, I've been asked to give feedback to senior leaders about areas that can use improvement. I've opted to start with the local leadership and give them a chance to step up for improvement before taking issues to senior leaders.
Interesting.
I can usually tell what the outcome will be based on local leadership's response.
Interesting.
Well, that's true. They have to implement, don't they? And if they don't want to, they likely won't. Okay, one fear I've encountered here is leaders who want to advance psychological safety but don't know how to do it, and fear to fail because they are not an expert in that. Yep. So they are lacking skills to create psychological safety, but when given the skills, they don't feel like they can put them in action.
Chris, I don't know if that's, I think you, are you at UW-Madison? I don't know if that's particularly visible at universities, but I think it is. I think we all punt, well, not we all punt. We frequently punt on issues like that by playing the disciplinary expertise game that I don't have disciplinary expertise, so I can't do that.
It's, when your identity is, yeah, it's a cop-out. When your identity is built around knowing the answers and you enter this territory that you feel ill-prepared for, I think it's scary for people. Working remote is more challenging than working in person because you don't always have that face-to-face connection.
True.
It takes a bit more trust to share potentially unsafe topics. Well, that's for sure. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting how face-to-face cues, a variety of sorts, either help you feel this is a person I can trust with what I want to say or not. That's really interesting.
Does anybody else have something they'd like to share? Okay. So if something more goes in the chat, then I will interrupt you, Pat, and share it.
Okay.
But
so I'm going to switch back to slides, but this is only the only other slide we have. We don't want to leave the topic hanging. Okay, we've identified some challenges for leaders, and we have some suggestions that, at least in our experience, do not resolve all those issues, but at least begin to allow some movement, some action that can start to break down perhaps some of the roadblocks for leaders to really encourage the kind of psychological safety we think is valuable. So let me share my screen and get this other slide up. So this is what leaders can do. It's a short list. And of course, we're going to invite you, if you like, to add more to it. So the idea is not to say everything. The first, though, is I would say for leaders is acknowledge your own fears. The list that we showed a minute ago, it's real. These are things that are not made up. They're not, I wouldn't want to call them foolish. They're real concerns, and many of those things really happen. The challenge, I would say, for many leaders is to, if you can, think about how might I respond differently when they happen, whatever, if the conversation goes in an unusual direction, or various members become quite emotional about what they have to say. So the first point we'd like to make is acknowledge your own fears. It's okay, in my view, it's okay to be afraid of these things. And it's okay to say, I'm not entirely sure what I'll do if that occurs. But it's also worthwhile to recognize where some of these drivers come from. Is it my organization that thinks I need to be the leader in control, or is that me? And my organization is perhaps more ambivalent, but I have it in my head. That's what I need to do. And of course, that if it's the latter, that gives me some opportunity. I might be able to change my thinking a little bit. So as we say, the first thing I think is acknowledge your own fears. What am I afraid of? Embarrassment, perhaps poor job performance reports. Some are quite real and very and worthy of consideration. Some may be more my own perception of what's likely to happen and what the consequences might be. Again, this is not to dismiss these concerns, but at least to think about them and acknowledge where they come from and what's real about them. Second, and a very practical one, is often if you or someone else or a leader is sort of beginning to sort of start to work on increasing psychological safety. Our experience has been, a specific example is creating community agreements, or we might a little bit more brusquely call it rules of engagement with a group. The idea here is to say, how do we have, for example, an open and safe conversation, and yet agree before we even start what's sort of off topic enough that we can say, okay, that's an interesting and challenging issue. That's not today's issue. Let's put that aside and focus on today's issue. We might also anticipate, depending on what the group is doing, there are going to be disagreements. And how will we handle disagreements? That's always really difficult to do in the middle of the disagreement, because by then our emotions are high, we're defending our turf or whatever it is we think, and it's really difficult. step back a little bit and say, well, how should we handle the fact we just don't see this issue the same? Way easier to sort of anticipate that and say, well, here's what we think we might do. My experience is this works great. One great way to do this is to suggest, for example, as provost, I used to often form ad hoc working groups and often would say, I suggest the group have some kind of community agreements. Here's 3 or 4 topics I suggest you say something about. You might add others of your own. It's up to you. But the key is the group should agree, oh, yes, this is how we'll talk. This is kind of the kind of conversations we'll create. And I think leaders can, at least again, in my experience, really help encourage that kind of community agreement and be a part of the community agreement themselves. So they're not outsiders. They are leaders or a member of the community and hopefully are part of the creation of these agreements and are abiding by whatever the agreements might be. Again, the goal here is to take a little bit of the uncertainty away and perhaps a little bit of the fear away from the kind of open conversation we might hope for in an environment of psychological safety, so we can work more towards that without fearing what happens. A big part of that is, of course, is articulating norms and boundaries before we start. And then we can challenge each other in the middle and say, you know, we agreed this is what was going to happen, or this is how we might handle a disagreement. Now we're in the middle of it. Let's review. This is how we said we'd handle it. Can we do that? And this is really important, I think, again, for difficult subjects. I'll mention one that certainly at the 2 campuses I've worked at is always challenging: issues of diversity, where there's strong emotion, lots of history, lots of background, lots of knowledge, but also, frankly, a reasonable amount of ignorance. And yet we want everyone in the conversation. How can we create a conversation that feels like everyone can be safe in that conversation? That's a challenging one, but one, for example, where these kind of community agreements, in our experience, have been hugely valuable in helping begin to build an environment of trust and safety for everybody in the conversation. And finally, at least in this list, we would say it's important to communicate to the group if we're having some discussion. As I mentioned, how are we going to manage the process? How are we going to deal with any conflicts? And frankly, what are we expecting our group to do? Are we making a decision? Are we providing advice? Are we brainstorming? So as you can tell from our viewpoint, these challenges we mentioned for leaders are real and they're genuine, but they're not insurmountable. And again, from my experience, and I think Kathy's experience, we've seen it, people begin to chip away at some of those challenges and actually move towards a more psychological safe environment. Kathy, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just want to also add that, you know, leaders can access the resources in their organizations for help with this, right? And so if human resources or your diversity administrator group can help you start with this outline and help you make this community agreement with your group, and you don't have to be all alone in it. You can get support. And to an earlier comment today, I think a lot of leaders think that if they're not experts in something, then they can't do it, right? And so the thing is if we do it together, then that helps to address that. So none of us, or most of us, aren't experts in this particular area, but we have to do it anyway. And so how do we get stronger and better at it? We practice, and we make it okay for people to fail.
Yeah.
Right? Because if we fail, then we have to figure out a way to fix what we've done and still move forward and forgive each other. So it's just this momentum that we can get if we do it together. So we had a question for you all as we end. Have you experienced or used any of these approaches? And if so, did they help? Okay, in higher ed, where the expectation is we deliver products, trainings, courses, how can we make failure okay? Oh, it's a big one. Pat, what do you think about failure of courses in higher ed?
Well, so my version of that is in kind of the more narrow version of courses, let's say courses I teach, is failure is if nobody learns anything. It's not failure if I present something that the next day I have to say, okay, part of what I said the other day turns out I found out is wrong. That's okay, failure for me, embarrassment for me, right? But students have learned an enormous amount from that situation. Not that I would do it on purpose, again, just for the effect. But to me, I would say be careful how we define failure. So define failure in a way that really is relevant, I'd say in this case, to higher ed, and not necessarily in a way that is, how I want to say, feels like the goal is, let's say, a smooth presentation or many of the trappings of success. If you can dig down to what are we really trying to do in higher ed or in any place else, and then failure is if we don't do that. And in my experience, we tend to label a lot of things failures that I don't think are really failures.
So, and somebody posted something that I think also speaks to it, right? That they were talking about a leadership class I was teaching, gosh, 11 years ago, right? And we always did this in CCLE too. We always had community agreements at the very beginning. And this whole idea that we're going to be learning to with each other and from each other. And these community agreements are something that we create together. So I think if you set those up in the beginning, and maybe failure is one of those things we need to add into the outline of what success and failure are when we're together, right? What are we trying to do together? Another physician said, I think establishing psychological norms and conflict strategies to be used in the event of conflict at the beginning of a group conversation is enormously helpful. I've tried one of our groups we work with is very dysfunctional and they like it that way. My team has been struggling with how best to work with them. We ultimately put together a list of expectations correlated with our organizational values. I shared it with the site lead and he agrees that they were reasonable expectations and supported organizational values. Then we shared it with the team and they proceeded to tell us why our expectations weren't reasonable. I love it. They're dysfunctional and they love it.
Well,
Yeah.
chaos does benefit some people. So even if, that's not something we articulate out loud, you can observe that when a group is dysfunctional and people like it, it doesn't have to be logical, but usually there's a reason. They perceive a benefit for that.
Yeah, or it's just what they're accustomed to. And so they can't imagine what things would be like if they were calmer. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I kind of regret sometimes that I'm not. I'm looking at the time though, it's past noon. So I just want to wrap up quickly. What we heard from you is that you all are very sophisticated in your understandings of psychological safety and what you've already tried. So we're glad to have spoken with you today. And Pat and I feel that this psychological safety co-creation has to be a skill that organizations are familiar with and competent in order to see the benefits from most else of organizational initiatives, right? Everything builds on that. The next talk we give on March 1st will be what we can do from our current positions, wherever we are, to seed more psychological safety. And we hope to see you there. The recording of this webinar will be posted on both of our sites. And if you have questions for us, you can email them to us at patrickfarrellconsulting@gmail.com or Catherine@catherinesandersphd.com. So thank you all. And we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks, everybody.